If you live in Texas and you don't know these top wild edibles found throughout the state, you may just be ashamed to your ancestors. So we're among the first few generations ever to not do at least some wild foraging. So learn from this video, hold the line, stop the loss of this ancient knowledge. And if the power cuts out, can you really trust the government to feed you? I'm only going to focus on plants that were historically considered staple foods by indigenous peoples in the region. And I'm a historical ethnobotanist, a biologist, a native Austinite, and I just published a book, Native Food Plants of Texas, covering 120 wild plants historically used for food by indigenous peoples throughout North America. You can find a link for that in the description. And so for each account in this video and in my book, I give detailed instructions on everything you need to know how to most easily take each plant to plate, describe its historical use by foraging societies, and even the nutritional benefits. So let's get right into it, starting with numero 5, wild onion. You may know this one, and compared to the other four, it probably has the least caloric value, still 20% carbs though. But I wanted to include a green and keep the list to things also very easy to ID and process, which wild onions certainly are. If it smells like a wild onion, it is. It's really that simple. And they look like some whole chives that you can buy at the grocery store. There are poisonous lookalikes of onions, but they do not have that distinct onion odor. You can generally find them in softer and more moist soils, but they're very widespread and abundant. Get them from late winter through midsummer, but the best parts change by season. So late winter and early spring, you're going for the grass-like shoots and leaf blades. Chop them up, use them like chives or dry for storage. And the leaves are good through late spring, at which point the bulbs are fully developed and good to harvest. You can pull them up by hand or loosen the soil a bit first with a sharp stick or something if it needs it. And use the bulbs in place of onions, and they can be sliced thin and dried for storage, or you can actually braid the whole plants and hang them to dry for use in stews and soups like the Comanche did. Now from late spring through midsummer, you get to harvest my favorite part. At this time, the leaves and bulbs have become somewhat fibrous to eat, but at the tops of the plants, they produce these little balls that look like fruits, but they're actually called sessile bulblets, and they're a special reproductive structure that drops off the plant and can grow into a new one. They're very crisp and juicy and very oniony, and I use them fresh in place of onions or similarly dry them for storage. They go great on top of salads. And the indigenous peoples of North America historically ate tons of wild onions from many species. They were most favored to season red meats and stews, but they were also cooked in bulk in earth ovens, dried for storage, and provided lots of good nutrients. So they have about 20% carbs, 2% protein, a good amount of vitamin C. They're excellent sources of copper, good sources of calcium, and moderate sources of magnesium. On to numero 4, wild grape. Oh yeah, did you know that the wild grape genus actually evolved originally in North America? And there are more species here than anywhere. And Texas in particular has a ton. The hybrids of some native central Texas grapes, like Vitis berlandieri, they're used as rootstocks in the modern grape industry globally. So even all those fancy French wines, because they're resistant to those aphid pests, which almost wiped out the industry before they started using those rootstocks. So every bottle of French wine has a bit of Texas in it, you can say. Anyway, wild grapes are awesome because you can really gather a ton. All wild grapes are edible, but look out for heartleaf peppervine, which is in the same family, but it has these weird colored inedible fruits. Without the fruits, you can still distinguish them by their bark, which in peppervine has these little bumps called lenticels, whereas the bark of grapes has these lengthwise fissures. By the way, the leaves of all grapes are also edible and have a nice, tart, mildly sweet, and herbaceous flavor. And if you try eating peppervine leaves, you'll know right away it's not grape because they're bitter, they lack that tart flavor, but I don't recommend trying it because they're not edible anyway. It's important to find a good spot for grape gathering because in an intact forest, they'll be out of reach in the canopy. So you want to look for areas where the vines cascade down from the forest edges, like the banks of rivers and creeks. Fence lines also make prime grape foraging spots. They ripen from late spring through late summer, peaking at midsummer when these sweet, tart, juicy fruits are so desirable. So thank you, grapes. Grapes come in clusters, and when harvesting them, I definitely recommend pulling off entire clusters. If you try to pull them off one by one, they're gonna fall apart on you. And you wanna know my little hack for making grape juice real quick and dirty? So you take the whole clusters, chuck them in a blender, stems and all. Add a bit of water, blend until smooth, strain that through a wire mesh strainer, and then boil the juice. Decant it, or you can add a bit more water and maybe some sugar, and then you've got some wild grape juice. The more traditional but lengthier process is to remove them from the stems, mash them up, slow cook them down, then strain out the seeds and skins through a cloth. Reboil, then you can can them or add some water for juice, also with sugar optionally added to taste. Now, with some grapes, especially these Mustang grapes, which are the most common in Central Texas, eating them raw can cause a burning sensation in your mouth and even on your hands if you're processing them barehanded. So heat completely removes this effect, which is one reason I say to boil the strained juice. Drying also removes the burning sensation, and I actually preserve most of my grapes by drying. Now for this, I definitely remove each grape from the stems first, then set them out in a single layer, and put them in a dehydrator at an oven below 200 degrees, but be careful not to burn them, or between two basketry trays in the sun, ideally not exposed to direct sunlight, which can degrade the color and nutrition. And depending on the method, it can take from a few hours to a week to dry. Once they're completely dry, I put them in a sealed container, like a big mason jar, and they'll last for years in good conditions. Now, indigenous peoples all over North America foraged and ate tons of wild grapes from a dozen different species. They were commonly dried for storage or made into things like cakes and cooked. So grapes are about 20% carbs, and the seeds contain a lot of healthy fats and proteins. Numero tres, la tuna, or the prickly pear. Did you know that the first European in Texas who wrote about it, Cabeza de Vaca, was essentially enslaved for a period to pick prickly pears full time? So these are absolutely clutch foods of natives throughout the Southwest. They're eaten everywhere they occur, which is just about everywhere between Argentina and Alberta, Canada, except for the Amazon basin. Now, these are too iconic to misidentify, and the closest plants, cholla, also have delicious edible fruits. In fact, it seems all cactus fruits are edible, but there are probably exceptions. There's thousands of species. And the big barrier, these dad-blamming little spines, not these big ones, but the almost invisible hair-like ones covering the plant. So they grow in each of these little dots and clusters, and they're called glochids. The fruits only have glochids, no big spines. But luckily, glochids are very easy to remove. You just brush or rub them off. So I use tongs to grasp and twist them off, and then a wad of grass or a brush to thoroughly rub them off. But there's tons of ways. You can use buckskin to rub them, or just on the ground or sand. Some people use like a water sprayer, others prefer to burn or skin them. Though I personally would not, as burning in the field is risky, and I like to remove the glochids as soon as I pick them. And skinning is just unnecessary work. The skin is totally edible, and it's helpful for preservation. So I rub off the glochids with a brush, put them in my bag, and later rinse the whole batch, especially because those glochids can actually cling perpendicular to the skin after being rubbed off. And to eat them, well, you can just eat them plain, but they are full of seeds that you shouldn't eat too many of to avoid some unpleasant obstructions. So I often throw the fresh whole ones into smoothies. Some people like to blend up a bunch and then strain out the seeds and skins to get prickly pear juice, which can be canned or used as is. So I follow a common historical method. I cut them in half lengthways and dry them. And like other stuff, I use a dehydrator, sun drying, or the oven. Once dry, the seeds are very easy to scrape out, and the rest of the dried flesh is like fruit leather. It tastes sweet and somewhat like watermelon, and it can be eaten plain and dry or soaked in water to rehydrate. The seeds are also entirely edible. So after scraping them out, I'll lightly toast them to get them completely dry for grinding. Then they can be ground up in a mill or food processor or stone mortar and pestle, though they do require some hard work since they're pretty hard. After that, I cook them into a mush or add them into other recipes as a meal. Prickly pear fruits have plenty of carbohydrates plus 8% protein, and they're good sources of magnesium. The stems are also very high in protein, magnesium, and other nutrients. Numero dos, pecan. Now this is an absolute nutritional powerhouse with 73% fat, 13% carbs, and 10% protein. They're excellent sources of magnesium, zinc, manganese, and copper, and moderate sources of potassium and iron. They're very rich in healthy fats, antioxidants, and vitamin E, can help reduce cholesterol and obesity. So pecan was a staple food of indigenous Texans and is still a highly regarded food among them. It was a popular trade item, and an early industry of Texas settlers was the pecan trade. These belonged to the hickory genus, Caria, and hickory nuts were important food sources of indigenous peoples throughout eastern North America. But pecan is the best in the genus because it has lots of nut meat and thin shells that are easy to crack. They're very easy to ID with these large compound leaves that have a particularly pleasant aroma when crushed. They look a lot like walnuts, also important edibles, but they can be distinguished by the twig pith, which is chambered in walnuts and homogeneous in pecan. More easily, they can be distinguished by the nuts, which have 4 sections in pecan with oblong nuts versus the unsectioned globular walnuts. The green pecan hulls split open from late summer through fall, releasing the nuts. You can actually gather full-size pecans before they split, but be aware that some are duds, or they lack nut meat. And you can tell these apart by their smaller size, underdeveloped seams, brownish color, and lighter weight. It's easy to gather tons of pecans, and I gather them both by pulling them from the tree or by gathering from the ground. To shell them, I simply use a hammerstone on a hard surface or a stone pestle on a cutting board. If you're going for the fewest strikes, hit them hard, end on, point up. And if you want more intact nut meat, hit them with a dozen lighter, sharp blows all along the outside of the shell, kind of like a hard-boiled egg. The big ones are most worth your time this way, but some trees produce really small pecans, but I still gather these, process them in a different way, making pecan oil. Now, I also learned this from historical indigenous practices, and it was commonly done for all hickories and walnuts. The huge benefit is you don't need to spend time shelling. You just crush up the whole nuts, shell and all. And once they're a course meal, you throw them in a pot of water and boil them good. And this makes the oil, which is, remember, over 70% of the nut meat, separate out. And I'll strain this whole decoction through some cloth to get the meal out, and then reheat that to isolate the oil to the top, from where it can be skimmed off and then the remaining water boiled away. But a neat trick I discovered on accident was that you can actually just freeze that decoction and then pour the oil cleanly from the ice. So I use this oil as it was historically for cooking in place of butter or olive oil, for hair or skin care, even for oiling wood. So pecans are produced in great abundance, and they're extremely calorie and nutrient dense, require minimal processing, but they're only numero dos? ¿Qué tal? Well, numero uno may surprise many of you, unless you've been following my work, in which case you should know I'm a huge advocate of this species. So, numero uno, also the numero uno wild plant food among indigenous peoples of the Southwest historically, the majestic, magnificent, magnanimous, multifaceted mesquite, honey mesquite to be exact, Neltuma glandulosa. But Cyrus, mesquite is a trash invasive tree and a water hog. Texas hate it. Boy, people hate on mesquite because they don't like how resilient it is when they try to clear cut it for ranching and development. It's definitely native, being eaten by natives for thousands of years, and has been present for around 1 million years in the Southwest. It was actually likely dispersed by extinct megafauna like the gomphotheres and the ground sloth, which is why it has those huge bean pods it produces in such abundance and really strong wood. It also has the deepest taproots of any known species, reaching down to 200 feet. Plus, it enriches the soils as a nitrogen fixer. And no, it's not a water hog that's been measured and debunked as a myth. But how is mesquite eaten? Well, first you gotta gather the pods. You can actually eat them at any stage, including when they're still green. But the green pods tend to be more bitter, and you can't make a meal from them like the mature pods. But they're not a bad snack in the field to simply chew on, suck out the juices, and spit out the fibers. And you can also make a drink from them, which I'll describe later. Dried, a good way to tell. But the mature pods are the best. And you know they're mature when they're falling from the tree, and when you shake them, you can faintly hear the beans rattle inside. and they should be a brown or reddish color and be easy to pull from the tree. I also will shake the whole trees and branches to get the out of reach ones to drop. But you gather them from the ground. I've noticed a lot of people will tell you to not do this, and I actually tracked down the source of this warning. So there was one study in Arizona where mesquite pods gathered from the ground were found to have high levels of aflatoxin, which is a carcinogen produced by fungal growth. But if you read the actual study, the pods were gathered after the seasonal monsoon rains there. Actually in October they were gathered. And this is several months after the pods drop, and I can guarantee you that they were visibly bad. Fresh dropped mesquite pods are a light beige or with a reddish color. Pods that have been rained on and sitting on the ground for a month or more, they have a darker brown color with black or dark spots, which is very obviously bad. So I personally gather most of my mesquite pods from the ground, but usually within a week or two of them dropping. And I'd be hesitant to gather them from the ground if it's rained since they dropped and they've been sitting there for a week or more. Another concern with ground-gathered pods is rodents or other animals gnawing at the pods, so inspect them to make sure that that hasn't happened. Now, most pods will show some signs of insect damage, usually of two types. One is the sap-feeding bugs, which leave small dots, often causing the sap to exude in that dot, which turns black. Now, mesquite sap always turns black on exposure to oxygen, so this is normal and safe to eat in my opinion. The other insect damage is from bruchid beetles. These burrow into the seeds, which the grubs eat, and then they burrow out as adults. So the holes are actually a sign that they've left, and you don't eat the seeds anyway. And if the grubs are in there, they're perfectly good to eat, the grubs, and they're part of the pod that's typically discarded. So I don't worry about these either. So I gather up a huge amount of the pods and store them in a dry spot. Now, what do you do with those bean pods? Well, two main things, both of which I learned, of course, from historical indigenous practices. Now, method one is the easiest, and I'll give the quick modern method, and then the slower but more universal ancient method. Method two requires a bit of work, but the final product is extremely useful and versatile. But first, you'll need to understand the anatomy of the bean pods. From outside to inward, there are several layers. The first is the thin skin, or exocarp. This is mostly fibrous and will be discarded. Just inside the skin, before you get to the beans, is this mesocarp. This is a spongy tissue layer, and it's 87% sweet, digestible carbs. This is the part of the mesquite pods that you eat, not the beans. Almost every indigenous peoples who ate mesquite, which is dozens of ethno-linguistic groups from the Southwest, the Great Basin, northern Mexico, and Texas, only ate this mesocarp layer and then discarded the beans. So the beans are composed of two parts. The first is kind of a hard, inedible shell, or the endocarp. Inside of this is a seed that actually can be eaten and was historically consumed by at least 4 tribes in my research, but always secondary to the mesocarp, because you can't just chew it up raw though. It has a hard seed coat protecting the endosperm. So the seeds were ground in a mortar and pestle, and the seeds were also contain a trypsin inhibitor, or an anti-nutrient. So they were generally cooked into a mush, with the cooking deactivating this compound. But the process of shelling the bean, grinding the small seeds, and cooking the meal is quite labor intensive, especially compared to simply extracting that sweet mesocarp tissue. So for the absolute easiest way to eat mesquite, simply throw a bunch of the pods in a blender, add water, blend until smooth, then strain through a wire mesh strainer. This yields a sweet, nutritious drink that tastes a bit like caramel and tamarind. Now, mesquite drink was one of the main historical indigenous ways of consuming mesquite, but obviously they lacked blenders. Instead, pods were pounded up with large mortars and pestles. I made one out of a willow tree trunk, and I used a mesquite branch for a pestle. The crushed pods were soaked in water, and that cold infusion was drunk, with the beans and fibers being strained out or simply let to sink to the bottom of the vessel. And such soaking vessels were kept supplied with crushed pods throughout the season, and the drink was often allowed to mildly ferment. And this didn't produce an intoxicating beverage, but likely served to preserve it, perhaps aided in the digestibility. As easy as mesquite drink is, it doesn't preserve forever, and it isn't very versatile. So mesquite pod meal or flour was made. Now to do this, you also simply grind up the pods and remove the beans and fibers, but the pods need to be really dry first. They can be sun-dried, or the Sari toasted them with hot sand. I sometimes put them in the oven at the lowest temperature to get them extra crispy, but not browned. If you try to grind them up and they aren't completely dry, they're gonna form a sticky mass that's impossible to reduce further. But the dried ones, you should be able to grind into a powder. And you can do this with a blender or food processor or the mortar and pestle. Now the beans, seeds, and fibers can be sifted out. You can get a coarse meal by using just a wire mesh strainer, but I like a flour sifter to get a finer meal. Now this sweet meal can be used in any baked good or added to just about everything to add some sweet flavor. Now historically this meal was made by pounding the dried pods in large mortars and sifting out the beans and fibers with various basketry. And the meal was kept preserved in large cakes for storage. And those were formed by layering the powder with a sprinkling of water and then more powder so it adhered to itself. And then these large cakes were sun-dried for storage or for trade. So if you appreciate this kind of knowledge, you're gonna love my book, Native Food Plants of Texas, where I cover all these species in even greater detail, plus 115 more, all based on historical indigenous practices. So links to the paper book and the ebook are in the description. Thanks for watching, y'all. Take it easy.